So the problem is the United States is a huge subsidizer and is in no position to lead any global reform efforts related to subsidies. Dan mentioned some of the top line numbers: 100 million in direct and indirect business subsidies, up from 90 million, 2.5 trillion, yes, trillion dollars in temporary stimulus since 2008. Then we have some depressing bipartisan examples, each detailed in my paper. The auto bailouts costing $45 billion in direct and indirect losses. GM and Chrysler, of course, are still struggling. Billions of dollars to the agriculture, into agribusiness, and special commodity support, dairy farmers, cotton, peanuts. And then, of course, my favorite, green goods, $24 billion in 2011. And a mind-numbing stat, 538 different state and federal subsidies for alternative fuels. And then last, the one you may have heard about debated in Congress right now, an extension of the wind production tax credit for 1 year is $12 billion more. So the problems with all of these subsidies are, many of them parallel the problems I've already mentioned globally. They hurt the economy, they breed cronyism and uncertainty, and they undermine American support for free markets. They also cause a lot of trade disputes. Tim mentioned the Boeing-Airbus dispute, but we've seen Chinese countervailing duty investigation of subsidized GM and Chrysler cars because of the bailouts. We've seen several CVD investigations of US biofuels and alternative fuels. We now see a new Chinese investigation of subsidized American polysilicon. And then, of course, Brazil has won the right to retaliate against the United States for US cotton subsidies. And that has resulted in not the removal of the US cotton subsidies, but $140 million in American taxpayer money going to Brazilian cotton farmers. Hush money. That's what this is. And so clearly, the current approach isn't working. And then finally, as I mentioned, all of this undermines US credibility on international subsidy reform. The other big problem is that the United States is a huge anti-subsidizer. Now, in and of itself, this wouldn't be a problem, and I've provided top-line stats here. We have 50 CVD orders on 12 countries, hitting about $11 billion in trade. China is the most frequent target, and I would note that those numbers are actually a bit misleading because, of course, once you impose the duties, the trade volumes go down quite significantly. And we actually see that in my paper. We have a big table that has all the disputes, and you can see pending cases have a lot more trade involved than completed cases, thereby showing quite a discouraging effect that our CVD orders have on foreign imports. Of course, there's also several WTO disputes. I've already mentioned the Airbus dispute that and of course we've taken Chinese wind power equipment. President Obama just recently announced a new dispute against Chinese auto subsidies and did that with a straight face, by the way. It's pretty impressive. Now, like I said, the use of CVD measures in and of themselves, in my opinion, is not a problem because they discourage government behavior. It's not like anti-dumping rules that target private practicing. These rules are intended to target bad government behavior. But they are a tax on US consumers, and there are tens of millions of dollars of duties paid each year by American importers. These lead to trade diversion, higher prices, and of course, market uncertainty. The other problem is that the US application of this US CVD law, in my opinion, reflects a capture by the domestic industry. There are misguided and politicized policy choices and methodological tricks, duties that exceed that necessary to remedy injurious subsidization. And these measures, because of all of these tricks, are repeatedly challenged and defeated at the WTO and the US courts. I don't have time to get into those right now, but I detail those in my paper, and many of them are ongoing as we speak. And again, the last problem is that these distract from the very real problems that we have with foreign subsidies and other foreign government practices, and of course, again, undermine any efforts the United States could put forth to lead some sort of global subsidy reform. So what do we do? Well, my solution, as I said, is for US policymakers to push for global subsidy reform. And this is especially true if they want to expand US exports. It seems like every American politician these days is talking about how we have to revive the economy with exports. Well, as these burgeoning CVD cases in places like China show against US imports, the more we push exports, the more we subsidize them, the more they're going to get hit with countervailing duties. But before we can do this via anti-subsidy rules or any other mechanism, the U.S. must document and then reform and eliminate targeted subsidies. I know that USTR kind of does this in an occasional report to the WTO, but there is no systematic effort in the U.S. government to do this. And thus, we don't know what the total effects of our targeted subsidies are. We don't know the economic effects of our countervailing duty measures. And to do this, there are things our politicians can say. First, they can raise the threat of anti-subsidy duties on U.S. exports. In other words, saying, look, I have to do this because if you want to export to China, you're going to get hit with CVD cases. And in fact, just a couple of days ago, the EU terminated a CVD case on American ethanol because we terminated the ethanol subsidy in 2011. These things actually do kind of work sometimes. So the other thing that our policymakers can do is promise to vigorously litigate foreign subsidies, again, through CVD law or at the WTO. Then the second suggestion is that we reform the application of US CVD law. I've given a very long and boring list of reforms in the paper. I don't need to tell you those. But a couple things I would mention. Monitoring and transparency. As I mentioned, we don't do that now, and we really should. The second is real consultations. WTO rules and US law actually require governments to undergo consultations before these disputes begin, either via CVD investigation or a WTO dispute. The problem is these consultations are a joke. Sometimes the governments don't show up, nobody knows what goes on, and the next thing you know, we have duties on products. A real consultations approach with the threat of impending duties might be able to do something here. Then, of course, to clean up the giant mess that is the countervailing duty and NME or non-market economy issue. China, of course, being the biggest non-market economy under the anti-dumping law, but Vietnam is also included. There are a host of problems with this. I document them in the paper, but it took an act of Congress to overrule the US courts to get to reapply all of these CVDs to China as an NME instead of doing a much more logical and sound reform that keeps us out of the WTO and keeps us out of US courts. And then finally, make all these other really boring methodological fixes that I mentioned. And of course, if we don't do this, then really it's just more of the same. And the debacles we see with Solyndra and Abound and many of the others that Tim writes about will inevitably continue.